The diplomatic station hung in the darkness of space like a jewel made of metal and light, spinning slowly between Earth and the rest of the galaxy that had finally noticed humanity existed after thousands of years of isolation. Ambassador Velcross stood in the observation deck and watched the human shuttle approach with what his species would call concern, but what humans might recognize as barely concealed terror. Though he would never admit such a thing to his superiors back on Centauri Prime, the Galactic Council had sent him because he was their best diplomat, someone who had negotiated treaties with over 40 different species across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for Deathworldership. Datapad hummed with information about Earth and its dominant species, and every single fact made his breathing stalks quiver with anxiety that he desperately tried to hide from his assistant. They evolved on a planet with gravity nearly twice our standard, his assistant Kriya said while reading from her own device. Their atmosphere contains a highly corrosive gas they require to live. She continued, they consume chemical toxins for recreational purposes and can survive radiation doses that would liquefy most species. She added with a tone that suggested she thought the data must be corrupted. Velcross said nothing because he had already read all of this and more, including the part about how humans had reached their moon using chemical rockets and primitive computers less advanced than a modern door lock. The human shuttle docked with a series of mechanical clangs that made several nearby diplomats jump in surprise because their own ships use silent magnetic coupling systems. The airlock cycled, and the door opened to reveal 5 humans standing in what they called their dress uniforms, which looked to Velcross like they were preparing for combat rather than diplomacy. Commander Sarah Chen stepped forward first, and she was shorter than Velcross had expected, though her presence filled the corridor in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. Ambassador Velcross, she said in perfectly accented Galactic common that must have taken years to learn. On behalf of Earth and humanity, thank you for welcoming us. Velcross performed the traditional Centaurian greeting of intertwined fingers and bowed his head slightly, which Sarah returned with reasonable accuracy, despite this being surely her first time meeting his species in person. Behind her stood 4 other humans, including a man whose uniform identified him as an engineer named Marcus Webb, and Velcross noticed that this human seemed unable to stand still for more than a few seconds at a time. The tour of the diplomatic station took 3 hours, and Velcross watched carefully as the humans examined everything with an intensity that suggested they were memorizing structural details for reasons he could not quite identify. Sarah asked intelligent questions about council procedures and galactic law, while Marcus kept drifting toward engineering spaces and asking technical questions that made the station's Quellan maintenance chief visibly uncomfortable. Your gravity generators use phase-locked quantum oscillators, Marcus said while peering at a wall panel that he absolutely should not have been able to identify from the outside. The Quellan maintenance chief, whose name was Thrixno, made a sound like escaping steam and confirmed that yes, that was correct. And how exactly did the human know that Marcus shrugged in that peculiarly human way and said something about the harmonic frequency being obvious from the slight vibration in the deck plates, which made Thrixnel's SI stalks curl in confusion, because those vibrations were specifically designed to be below the perception threshold of every known species. Cultural exchange dinner that evening was held in the station's main reception hall, where representatives from 23 different species had gathered to meet. The newcomers from Sol System tables had been arranged with food suitable for various metabolisms, and the humans had brought some of their own dishes, which the station safety officer had scanned 3 times before, reluctantly allowing them into the Halval Cross. Watched as a Vratzian diplomat tried what humans called whiskey and immediately collapsed while gasping that they had been poisoned, before a medical team rushed over and the humans explained apologetically that they had forgotten that What they considered a beverage was technically an industrial solvent to most other species. Sarah looked mortified and apologized profusely while Marcus tried very hard not to laugh and failed badly enough that several species who understood human expressions backed away nervously. Evening proceeded with more success after that incident, and the humans proved to be surprisingly good conversationalists who seemed genuinely interested in learning about the Council and its member species. Then, the gravity failed in the eastern quarter of the station. Alarms blared and Thrixnel came running into the hall while shouting that the primary stabilizer had catastrophically malfunctioned, and they needed to evacuate that entire section immediately before people started floating into the faunus. Walls Marcus stood up so fast his chair fell over backward. "I can fix that," he said with confidence that seemed completely unearned given that he had been on the station for less than 6. Horse Thrixnel's eye stalks went rigid, and the maintenance chief explained with barely restrained panic that this was Quellan technology, far beyond human understanding, and that it would take specialists 3 days to arrive with replacement parts. Marcus was already walking toward the engineering section. Sarah called after him, but he waved her off and said something that made Velcross translation implant stutter in confusion before delivering what it claimed was the closest approximation. "Hold my beer," Marcus said while handing his glass to a shocked Vraxian server. The humans at the table went quiet in a way that suggested this phrase carried significance beyond its literal meaning. Marcus disappeared into the corridor leading to the engineering spaces with Thrixnel chasing after him while shouting about safety protocols and unauthorized access. Velcross stood and moved to follow, because his diplomatic instincts told him that something important was happening, even if he did not yet understand what. He arrived in the engineering bay to find Marcus already elbow-deep in the gravity stabilizer with the access panel torn off and lying on the floor. Thrixnel was making sounds like a boiling kettle and explaining that touching the quantum oscillators while they were active would either disintegrate a person or scatter their atoms across several dimensions. Marcus said something like, "Yeah, probably," and then did something with his hands that made the entire stabilizer shriek and pulse with light. The gravity in the eastern quarter flickered and then stabilized and then came back stronger than before. Marcus pulled his arms out of the machine and wiped his hands on his uniform while looking pleased with himself. "There you go," he said cheerfully. "Your third oscillator was out of phase because someone installed it upside down." Thrixnel stared at the human, and then at the machine, and then back at the human. "That is impossible," the Quellan said weakly. "You would have needed to recalibrate the quantum field by hand, and no biological being can survive contact with an active field." Marcus held up his hands, which were slightly red like he had touched something hot, but were otherwise undamaged. "Huh," he said while examining his palms. "That explains the tingling." Velcross felt something shift in his understanding of humanity at that moment. These were not just another species. These were Deathworlders who did not seem to understand that death was supposed to stop them. He returned to his quarters that night and began writing a report to the Council with recommendations that he suspected they would find difficult to believe in. The margins he added a personal note about the phrase, "hold my beer," and suggested that perhaps someone should study what it meant in human culture. He had a feeling it was going to be important. The Arclean sat in her laboratory surrounded by holographic displays, showing human behavioral data, and wondered if she had gone completely insane or if the rest of the galaxy was about to learn a very dangerous lesson. The xenobiologist had spent 3 weeks studying humanity since their arrival at the diplomatic station, and every single day brought new evidence that these Deathworlders operated on principles that violated everything the Galactic Council thought they knew about intelligent life. Or assistant Marley shuffled through the door, carrying another data crystal filled with human historical records. "You are not going to believe what I found," Marley said while loading the crystal into the analyzer. The holographic display flickered to life and showed a human male standing on top of what appeared to be a primitive vehicle. According to the timestamp, this recording was from nearly 200 years ago in human history. Human in the recording was speaking to another human, and the translation software captured his words clearly. "Hold my beer," the human said, before attempting to jump his vehicle over a ravine that was obviously too wide for any reasonable chance of success. He failed catastrophically and tumbled into the ravine and somehow survived with what humans called broken bones. "There are thousands of these," Marley said while pulling up file after file. "Every single one starts with that phrase or some variation of it." Clan watched recording after recording of humans saying, "Hold my beer," before doing things that should have killed them. Humans jumping off structures. Humans combining chemicals they clearly should not combine. Humans riding animals that were trying to murder them. Attaching rockets to furniture and sitting on it. It is a behavioral trigger, Client said slowly while her mind raced through the implications. When a human says this phrase, they are about to attempt something catastrophically dangerous. She spent another week compiling her research, and then requested an audience with the Galactic Council Safety Committee. The committee consisted of representatives from 12 species, and they gathered in a circular chamber designed to make everyone feel equally important. Clean stood at the center and activated her presentation. Members of the committee, she began, I have discovered a pattern in human behavior that poses a significant risk to galactic safety. She showed them the compilation of Hold My Beer incidents from human history. She explained the statistical correlation between the phrase and dangerous activity. She presented psychological profiles suggesting that humans experienced something they called an adrenaline rush that actually made them enjoy mortal peril. The committee members looked at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to dismissal. Committee Chairman Vexthal, who was a Pluvian with skin like polished stone, spoke first. Dr. Klein, he said in the condescending tone that academics use when they think a colleague has embarrassed themselves. Surely you are not suggesting that an entire intelligent species has a verbal trigger for suicidal behavior. That is exactly what I am suggesting. Klein replied while keeping her voice steady. Another committee member, whose name was Tresval, laughed in the chittering way her species expressed amusement. This is clearly cherry-picked data, Tresval said. Every species has individuals who engage in risky behavior. Klein pulled up statistics showing that over 70% of humans had at some point in their lives said, Hold my beer, or equivalent phrases before doing something dangerous. The committee was unimpressed. Your sample size is contaminated by selection bias, Vexthal declared. I move that we table this discussion and return to actual safety concerns. The vote was 11-1 against implementing any kind of warning protocol. Klein left the chamber, feeling frustrated but not surprised because she had been in academia long enough to know that established institutions rarely accepted paradigm-shifting information without significant resistance. 3 days later, the crisis arrived. A Vraxian cargo hauler, designated Heavy 7, suffered a catastrophic engine failure while passing through the Theta sector near a moon that housed a colony of 40,000 Quellan citizens. The ship's automated distress call reached the diplomatic station within minutes. Valkrus was the ranking council member present, and he immediately convened an emergency session in the command center. Situation was dire. Heavy 7's antimatter containment was failing, and according to the ship's chief engineer, they had perhaps 2 hours before a breach that would destroy the ship and irradiate the nearby moon. Standard rescue protocols required specialized salvage vessels that were at least 6 hours away. We need to evacuate the moon colony, Valkros said, while his breathing stalks quivered with stress. 40,000 people in 2 hours, Thrixnell said from his station. The transport capacity does not exist. The humans had been standing quietly at the back of the command center commander. Sarah Chun stepped forward and began examining the tactical display. What if we intercept the cargo hauler and manually restart the containment field? She asked. Every being in the command center turned to look at her. The radiation levels would kill anyone who got close. Velcross explained patiently. And the ship is tumbling, which makes docking impossible. A human pilot named Jenny Rodriguez moved to stand beside Sarah. Jenny was shorter than most humans, and her uniform had patches that Sarah had explained indicated expertise in what they called high-risk maneuvers. I can match the tumble and get close enough, Jenny said while studying the tactical readout. The command center erupted in multiple languages as various species explained why this was impossible. The cargo hauler was spinning on 3 axes. The radiation field was increasing exponentially. No pilot could match that kind of chaotic motion long enough to achieve docking. Jenny listened to all of this with a calm expression that Velcross was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. I need a Type 7 shuttle with enhanced shielding and manual override controls, Jenny said to Sarah. Sarah looked at her pilot for a long moment, and something passed between them that Velcross could not quite interpret. Do it? Sarah said. Jenny walked toward the docking bay while pulling on a radiation suit. She passed by Velcross, who was still processing what was happening. The human pilot stopped and looked around the command center until she spotted a beverage station. She walked over and poured herself something from a container labeled coffee. Then she walked back to Velcross and held out the cup. Hold my beer, she said, then paused. Well, coffee, but you get the idea. Velcross took the cup automatically and felt something cold settle in his chest. At read Dr. Klein's report, he knew exactly what this phrase meant. Wait, he said. But Jenny was already jogging toward the docking bay. Velcross looked down at the cup of coffee in his hands, and then at Sarah, who was coordinating with the shuttle bay crew. Commander Chun, he said urgently. The phrase your pilot just said. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time since arriving at the station, she smiled. Yeah, she said. Jenny's about to do something crazy. Should we stop her? Velcross asked. Could you, Sarah? Repleed. Velcross realized he could not. The shuttle launched, and every being in the command center watched their displays as Jenny Rodriguez piloted toward a tumbling radiation-soaked cargo hauler with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she did this sort of thing regularly. Di Klein appeared in the command center doorway. She looked at the tactical display and then at Velcross holding a cup of coffee. She said it. Klein said. The human said the phrase. Yes, Velcross confirmed. They both turned to watch the display. The shuttle was approaching the cargo hauler, and Jenny was providing a running commentary that the communication system was broadcasting to everyone. Okay, Heavy 7 is doing about 20 rotations per minute on the primary axis, Jenny said conversationally, and she is wobbling on the secondary, which is going to be annoying. Annoying, Velcross thought distantly. She described piloting into a radiation field toward a tumbling antimatter bomb as annoying. The shuttle matched the cargo hauler's rotation and began closing the distance. Every pilot in the command center was making sounds of disbelief in their various languages. No one can maintain that kind of synchronization. Someone said Jenny apparently could. The shuttle kissed against the cargo hauler's emergency airlock with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Docked, Jenny reported. Going inside now. 15 minutes later, she manually restarted the containment field from inside the cargo hauler's engine room while being exposed to enough radiation to kill most species 3 times over 20 minutes. After that, she flew back to the diplomatic station. Velcross met her in the docking bay, still holding her coffee. Jenny climbed out of the shuttle, looking tired but unhurt. Thanks for holding that, she said while taking the cup back. Velcross stared at her. You just saved 40,000 lives, he said. Jenny shrugged and drank her coffee, which had gone cold. Yeah, well, she said. Somebody had to. That night, Velcross sent an urgent message to the Galactic Council. The subject line read, Implement Protocol, HMB, immediately. Leray Klein had been right all along. The recording of Jenny Rodriguez saving HFY spread across the galactic network within 48 hours, and by the end of the week, every species with access to communication technology had watched a human pilot do the impossible while treating it like a minor inconvenience. Commander Sarah Chun sat in her quarters aboard the diplomatic station and scrolled through news feeds from 17 different worlds. Deathworlder saves thousands, read one headline from a Vraxian news outlet. Human pilot performs miracle rescue, announced a Centauran broadcast. What else can these terrifying creatures do? Asked a Quellan opinion piece that seemed genuinely worried about the answer. Sarah found the whole thing amusing in a way that probably said something about human psychology. Her door chimed, and Marcus Webb entered carrying 2 bottles of what passed for beer on the station. You are now the second most famous human in the galaxy, Marcus said while handing her a bottle. Second, Sarah asked. Marcus pulled up a video feed showing Jenny being interviewed by a journalist whose species Sarah did not recognize. The journalist was asking Jenny how she felt about being called a hero, and Jenny was clearly uncomfortable with the attention. I just flew a shuttle, Jenny said on the recording. Anyone could have done it. The journalist made a sound like wind through crystals, which Sarah's translation implant identified as laughter. Pilot Rodriguez, the journalist said, our species' best pilots analyzed your approach vectors, and they say what you did violates at least 4 laws of physics. Jenny looked confused. Physics does not have laws you can violate, she said. It just has suggestions about what usually happens. Marcus paused the video and grinned at Sarah. She is going to start a philosophical revolution, he said. The Galactic Council moved faster than Sarah had expected. Within 2 weeks, they implemented what they officially called Safety Protocol 7, but what everyone immediately started calling Protocol HMBTH. A protocol was simple. When a human uttered the phrase "hold my beer" or any recognized variation thereof, all non-essential personnel were to evacuate to minimum safe distance. The Council issued guidelines for what constituted safe distance, but those guidelines kept being revised upward as humans continued to demonstrate that their definition of survivable and everyone else's definition of survivable existed in completely different universes. Sarah thought the protocol was ridiculous until Marcus proved exactly why it was necessary. They were visiting a Council research station studying quantum foam when one of the Pluvian scientists mentioned that their primary observation array had malfunctioned. The sensor package is in a region of unstable quantum foam, the scientist explained. We have lost 3 remote drones trying to retrieve it, and the insurance company has forbidden us from sending more. Marcus, who had been examining the sensor logs, looked up with an expression Sarah had learned to dread. I can get it, Marcus said. The Pluvian scientist, whose name was Dexrin, made a sound like grinding rocks. The quantum foam in that region fluctuates between 7 different dimensional states, Dexrin said. Anything entering it gets torn apart at the molecular level. Marcus was already pulling up schematics of the research station. Yeah, but it fluctuates on a predictable cycle, right? The Dexrin confirmed that yes. There was a 17-second window every 3 minutes where the foam stabilized enough that theoretically something could survive passing through it. Theoretically, Dexrin emphasized, as in never actually tested, because who would be insane enough? Marcus looked at Sarah. Do not, Sarah said. I can time it, Marcus said. Marcus, Sarah began. He was already walking toward the equipment bay. Hold my beer, he called over his shoulder. The evacuation alarm began blaring immediately. Sarah watched from a safe observation post as Bistos Marcus, suited up in a standard EVA suit that was definitely not rated for quantum foam exposure, launched himself from the station's airlock with a precision that suggested he had calculated the trajectory in his head. The quantum foam region looked like space having a seizure, with reality bending and folding in ways that made Sarah's eyes hurt. Marcus hit the fluctuation cycle perfectly. Passed through during the 17-second stability window, he grabbed a sensor package he launched. Back toward the station, he made it through the return window with 2 seconds to spare. Dex Wren stared at the retrieved sensor package like it was a religious artifact. "You timed that by eye," the Pluvian said weakly. "Yeah," Marcus confirmed while removing his helmet. "I have a good sense of rhythm." The story spread, and suddenly humans were being contacted by research stations and exploration teams and mining operations all across Council space. Did they need someone to repair a reactor that was slowly going supercritical? A human did. They need someone to explore a planet with an atmosphere that dissolved. Most known materials. Call a human did. They need someone to negotiate with a species that communicated through ritual combat. Call a human who would probably think it was fun. Sarah found herself spending more time coordinating human assignments than doing actual diplomacy. A geological survey team needed someone to collect samples from an active volcano. She sent Rodriguez, who returned with the samples and third-degree burns she treated with basic first. Aida's archaeology expedition needed someone to enter a temple that previous explorers described as a death trap. She sent Marcus, who came back with detailed scans and a story about dodging laser grids that made it sound like he was describing a particularly entertaining game. A medical research facility needed someone to test a vaccine for a disease that had a 70% fatality rate in humans. She sent Dr. Amy Chen, who volunteered immediately and survived the disease with symptoms she described as basically a bad cold. The galactic insurance industry began having what humans would call a collective nervous breakdown. Insurance companies had spent thousands of years developing actuarial tables for risk assessment. Humans broke every single table. How do we calculate premiums for a species that treats death as an inconvenience? One insurance executive asked during a council economic session. "You do not," replied the Vraxian council member, who had tried human whiskey and never recovered his faith in rational behavior. Several species proposed limiting human participation in council activities. The proposal came before the full council, and Sarah attended the session to hear what would be said. A Quellan representative, whose name was Plixner, stood to speak. "The humans are dangerous," Plixner declared. "They encourage unsafe behavior, and their presence is destabilizing our established safety protocols." A cause Centauran representative named Kelthus disagreed. "The humans have solved 14 problems in the last month that we classified as unsolvable," Kelthus said. "Perhaps the issue is not that they are unsafe, but that we have become too safe." The debate went on for 3 hours. Sarah listened and said nothing, because sometimes the best diplomacy was knowing when to let others argue your case. Finally, Velcross stood to speak, and the chamber quieted, because everyone knew he had spent the most time with humans. "I have watched these Deathworlders for 2 months," Velcross said, "and I have come to understand something important." He paused and looked around the chamber. "They are not reckless," he continued. "They are competent beyond our ability to measure competence, and they have such confidence in that competence that what we perceive as suicidal, they perceive as Tuesday." The chamber was silent. "I propose we grant humans full provisional status as council members," Velcross said. "And I propose we keep Protocol HMB in place, not to protect them, but to protect us from our own temptation to try what they make look easy." The vote was closer than Sarah had hoped, but it passed. Humanity was now provisionally part of the Galactic Council. That evening, Sarah gathered her team in their quarters on the diplomatic station. Jenny was there along with Marcus and Dr. Amy Chen and a dozen other humans who had been making names for themselves across council space. "We are in," Sarah told them. Provisional status for now, but full membership possible within a year. Marcus raised his bottle of truly terrible station beer. To making the galaxy weird, he said. To making the galaxy weird. Everyone echoed outside the window. Stars spun in the darkness, and somewhere out there, a Pluvian scientist was probably trying to calculate the probability that humans were actually just very lucky. Instead of genuinely skilled, Sarah knew the truth: humans were not lucky. They were just too stubborn to understand what impossible meant, and the galaxy was slowly learning that when you told a human something could not be done, you had just issued them a personal challenge protocol. HMB was not going to be enough. The galaxy was going to need a much bigger evacuation plan. The emergency broadcast reached every council member simultaneously at what humans would call 3 a.m. station time, and Velcross jerked awake in his quarters with his breathing stalks already constricting in anticipated stress. The message was brief and catastrophic. HFY Prime was dying. The planet that housed the eldest archive was experiencing cascading tectonic failure caused by illegal mining operations that had destabilized the planetary core, and according to the initial reports, they had perhaps 48 hours before the entire world tore itself apart. Velcross arrived at the emergency council session to find the chamber already filled with representatives from every major species, all talking over each other. In a dozen languages, the eldest archive was not just a library, it was 10,000 years of accumulated galactic knowledge stored in a quantum-entangled crystalline matrix that was physically bonded to the planet's magnetic field. You could not move it, you could not copy it, because the quantum entanglement would collapse if HFY Prime died. The archive died with it, and 10 millennia of history and science and art would vanish. We need to evacuate the caretakers. Someone was saying, we need to salvage what we can. Another voice argued, we need to accept that some things cannot be saved. A third voice said, with resignation. Velcross felt something cold settle in his chest because he had heard that tone before. It was the sound of intelligent beings accepting defeat because they could not imagine victory. The human delegation arrived 20 minutes later. Commander Sarah Chun looked like she had been woken from sleep, which she almost certainly had been, and behind her came 3 humans that Velcross recognized from their files. Dr. Hank Morrison was a geologist who had published 17 papers on planetary formation. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka was a demolitions expert whose military record was so heavily redacted that even Council intelligence could not determine what half of it meant. Dr. James Parker was a quantum physicist who had apparently been banned from 4 different research facilities for what his file described as excessive enthusiasm for direct experimentation. Sarah listened to the situation briefing without interrupting. The other humans studied the holographic displays showing HFY Prime's deteriorating condition. When the briefing finished, there was a long silence. The planet can be stabilized, Hank Morrison said. Every being in the chamber turned to stare at him. The tectonic cascade is being driven by pressure buildup in the lower mantle. Hank continued while manipulating the holographic display. If we could release that pressure in a controlled way, the planet would restabilize. A Pluvian geologist whose name Velcross could not remember made a sound like rocks grinding. The pressure is building in 17 different locations simultaneously, the Pluvian said. There is no way to release it in a controlled manner. Hank smiled in the way humans smiled when they were about to suggest something alarming. We use precisely placed nuclear charges to create release channels, he said. The chamber erupted in shouting. Nuclear devices were banned for use on inhabited worlds. Calculations required would take months. The placement would require accessing magma chambers hot enough to vaporize any known material. Hank listened to all the objections and then looked at Yuki Tanaka. Can you place 17 charges in 48 hours? He asked. Yuki studied the display showing the planet's internal structure. If I can get to the locations. Yeah, she said. Placement is easy. Getting to the locations is suicide. The Pluvian geologist said. The magma chambers are collapsing. And the tectonic shifts are creating seismic events that measure 9.7 on the standard scale. Yuki shrugged. I have worked in worse conditions. She said Velcross believed her because her file had mentioned something about diffusing explosives in an active war zone during an earthquake. Dr. James Parker was examining a different part of the display. The archive's quantum entanglement is going to collapse when the magnetic field destabilizes. He said, someone needs to go into the archive core and manually recalibrate the entanglement to the new magnetic field parameters. A Quellan physicist whose breathing tubes had gone pale with horror spoke up. The quantum field around the archive core would tear apart anything that entered it. The Quellan said, the energy flux alone would kill any biological being instantly. James looked thoughtful. Probably, yeah, he agreed. But someone still needs to do it. Sarah Chun had been quiet during this entire exchange. Now she stood, and every human in the room looked at her. You were talking about surfing tectonic shockwaves to place nuclear devices in collapsing magma chambers. Sarah said to her team, and then manually entering a quantum field that will probably disintegrate you. She looked at each of them in turn. Yes. Hank said. Yes. Yuki confirmed. Yes. James agreed. Sarah turned to face the council, humanity volunteers to save the eldest archive. She said for Malavel Cross found himself standing. Commander Chun. He said carefully, I must point out that this plan has almost no chance of success. Sarah smiled at him. Ambassador? She replied, I must point out that we are humans, and almost no chance is better odds than we usually get. Hank Morrison walked over to where Yuki Tanaka was studying the seismic data. He pulled out a small flask from his jacket pocket. The flask contained what Velcross had learned was called whiskey. Hank handed the flask to Yuki. Hold my beer. He said the council chamber's evacuation alarms began blaring immediately. Protocol HMB had been triggered, and within 30 seconds, the only beings left in the chamber were humans and Velcross, who had refused to leave. You are staying, Sarah asked him. I am the council's liaison to humanity. Velcross said, if you are going to attempt the impossible, I should probably document it. The humans accepted this with nods and began planning in earnest. They had 48 hours to save a planet. They had 3 people and equipment that the council's quartermaster reluctantly provided after Sarah invoked about 17 different emergency protocols. Velcross accompanied them to Archeos Prime because someone needed to coordinate with the archive's caretakers and because he had developed what humans would call a morbid curiosity about just how far Deathworlders could push the boundaries of survival. The planet looked sick from orbit. The surface was splitting along massive fault lines, and the atmospheric readings showed volcanic ash clouding the skies. They landed near the archive, which sat in a valley that was somehow still relatively stable. The archive's head caretaker was an ancient Centaurian named Velmos, who had spent 300 years maintaining the crystalline matrices. You came, Velmos said with surprise. We came, Sarah confirmed. You should evacuate, Velmos told her. The planet has perhaps 30 hours left. Hank was already unloading seismic sensors. Yuki was checking her equipment, which included a suit that looked like it was designed to survive inside a star. James was staring at the archive with an expression of wonder. It is beautiful, James said quietly. The archive was beautiful. It rose from the valley floor like a crystal mountain, and it pulsed with light that shifted through colors as the quantum entanglement fluctuated. Yeah, Velmos agreed. It would be a shame to lose it. We are not going to lose it, Hank said with confidence that seemed completely unjustified given the circumstances. Yuki looked at Sarah. I need to start placement in 6 hours, she said. The tectonic shifts are accelerating. Sarah nodded. James needs to enter the archive core 24 hours from now. she said. Which means we need the planet stable enough that the quantum field does not tear him apart before he can do his work. It was a plan that required perfect timing and impossible execution. Velcris watched the humans begin their preparations. He had sent a message to Dr. Klein before leaving the station. The message had been simple. They said it again. Her response had been even simpler. Document everything. So Velcros activated his recording implant and prepared to witness either the greatest rescue in galactic history or the most spectacular failure ever attempted. He suspected it would be both. The humans moved with purpose and precision. They did not seem worried. They did not seem scared. They seemed like people doing a difficult job that needed to be done. Velcros realized something in that moment. This was what humans had evolved to do. They had evolved on a world that tried to kill them daily. They had learned to look at death and laugh. They had learned to see impossible and say, hold. My beer, the galaxy was built by species that had evolved in safety. Humanity had evolved in chaos. And now chaos was coming to Arceus Prime. The only question was whether chaos or humanity would win. Velcros suspected he knew the answer, but he was going to document it anyway. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka descended into the first magma chamber wearing a suit that had been designed for brief exposure to extreme heat, and she was about to use it for extended work in conditions that would melt most known metals. Velcros watched her vital signs from the surface command post that Hank Morrison had established in a reinforced shelter near the archive. Temperature outside her suit is 4,000 degrees. Hank said while monitoring the readouts. She has about 20 minutes before the cooling system fails. Yuki's voice came through the communication system, sounding remarkably calm for someone standing inside what was essentially a pocket of liquid rock. I can see the pressure vent, she reported. Placing charge now. The seismic sensors showed the ground shifting. A tremor measuring 8.9 rolled through the valley, and Velcros grabbed onto a support beam to stay upright. Yuki, Sarah called over the comm. You need to evacuate that chamber. Almost done. Yuki replied. The charge was a small nuclear device that had been calibrated to create a controlled explosion that would open a vent channel from the magma chamber to the surface. In theory, this would release pressure. In practice, this required placing a bomb in an unstable magma chamber while earthquakes tried to kill you. Yuki finished the placement and began climbing back up the access shaft she had descended. The suit's cooling system failed when she was 30 meters from the surface. The temperature inside her suit began rising, and her vital signs started showing. Heat stress. She kept climbing. She emerged from the shaft with her suit smoking and her face red from heat exposure. Charge 1 placed, she reported while Hank sprayed her with coolant. 16 to go. She added over the next 18 hours. Yuki placed all 17 charges while Arceus Prime tried to kill her in increasingly creative ways. Magma Chamber 7 collapsed while she was inside it, and she had to blast her way out using emergency charges. Chamber 12 filled with toxic gas that dissolved part of her suit's filtration system. Chamber 15 experienced a pressure spike that launched her 50 meters up the access shaft, and she somehow landed on her feet. Velcros watched it all and updated his report to Dr. Klinn with increasing disbelief. By hour 20, Yuki had placed the final charge and returned to the surface, looking exhausted but triumphant. All charges placed, she confirmed. Ready for detonation sequence. Hank checked his calculations one final time. The detonations had to happen in a precise sequence with exact timing. Too fast, and the pressure would not release properly. Too slow, and the cascading failures would continue detonating in 3. Hank said, 2-1. Mark. The ground shook as 17 nuclear devices detonated simultaneously deep inside Arceus Prime. The seismic sensors went wild. The planet's surface rippled like water, and then slowly the readings began to stabilize. The Cascading tectonic failures stopped the pressure in the mantle, began equalizing. The planet was healing. It worked. Valmos said in a voice filled with wonder. You actually stabilized the planet. Yeah, Hank agreed while studying his readouts. Though the magnetic field is still fluctuating, which means James needs to get into that archive core before the quantum entanglement collapses. Dr. James Parker had been preparing for this moment for the last 20 hours. He stood at the entrance to the archive's core chamber, wearing a suit that was covered in equipment Velcross did not recognize. The quantum field is at 70% stability. A Quellen technician reported. It will collapse completely within 2 hours. James nodded and looked at Sarah. If this works, I will probably be unconscious when you pull me out. He said conversationally. If it does not work, he continued, do not. Sarah interrupted. I am just saying you should probably prepare for some disturbing quantum effects. James finished. He walked toward the archive core. Sarah called after him. James, she said. He turned. Come back, she told him. I always do, he replied. With a grin, then he stepped through the barrier into the quantum field that surrounded the archive's heart. The field was visible to unaugmented vision. It looked like reality was folding in on itself. Repeatedly, colors that should not exist flickered. At the edges, James walked into it and disappeared. Velcross watched the monitoring equipment. James's vital signs fluctuated wildly. His quantum signature scattered across 7 dimensions. His neural activity spiked to levels that should have caused immediate brain death. He's still alive, the Quellen technician said with disbelief. He should not be alive. Inside the quantum field James was working. Velcross could see him through the distortion, was manipulating the crystalline matrices by hand. He was recalibrating the quantum entanglement to match the planet's new magnetic field parameters. Was doing it without any protection beyond his suit and his apparently indestructible human stubbornness. 20 minutes passed. The archive's quantum signature began stabilizing. The entanglement was recalibrating, was working. Then James collapsed. His vital signs flatlined. Get him out. Sarah ordered. Hank and Yuki ran to the barrier. They reached through the quantum field and grabbed James and pulled him out. He was unconscious, and his suit was smoking. His vital signs were erratic but present. He was alive. The Quellen medical team rushed forward with equipment. They scanned James and made sounds of confusion. His cellular structure has been partially converted to a quantum state. One medic reported. He exists in multiple probability states simultaneously. Can you fix it? Sarah asked. We do not know, the medic admitted. This has never happened before. James's eyes opened. He looked around with an expression of wonder. I can see things, he said quietly. What things? Sarah asked. Colors that do not exist yet. James replied. Dimensions that have not unfolded. The probability waves of every particle in this room. He sat up despite the medical team's protests. Also, I can see in ultraviolet now, which is weird. He added. Behind them, the archive pulsed with steady light. The quantum entanglement had stabilized. The eldest archive was saved. Valmos approached the humans with tears running down the ancient Centaurian's face. 10,000 years of knowledge. Valmos said. 10,000 years that would have been lost. You saved it all. The caretaker continued. Sarah looked at her team. Yuki was sitting on the ground with her ruined suit beside her. Hank was reviewing the seismic data with satisfaction. James was trying to explain quantum chromodynamics to a confused medical technician. We did our job, Sarah said simply. The news of the archive's salvation spread across the galaxy faster than the story of Jenny's rescue. This was not one human doing something impossible. This was 3 humans doing 3 impossible things simultaneously. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Velcross attended via hologram because he was still on Archeos Prime, helping coordinate the recovery efforts. The Council chamber was packed. Every species wanted to be present for what was clearly a historic moment. Council Chairman Vexthul stood to speak. The humans have saved the eldest archive, Vexthul said formally. They have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our understanding. I move that we grant humanity full council membership immediately. The chairman continued. The vote was unanimous. Humanity was now a full member of the Galactic Council, but Velcross noticed something else happening. The other species were looking at humans differently, now not with fernet, with confusion, with something that might have been hope. Because if humans could save a dying planet, if they could walk into quantum fields that should kill them, if they could look at impossible and laugh, then maybe impossible was not as absolute as everyone had thought. The protocol HMB warning system remained in place, but now it included a second protocol HMB observer. When a human said, "Hold my beer," evacuation was still mandatory, but observers were encouraged to watch from a safe distance, because you were probably about to see something that would change your understanding of what was possible. Dr. Client published her final report on human behavior. The conclusion was simple. Humans had evolved on a world that made impossible a daily requirement for survival. They had learned to treat death as a challenge rather than an ending. They had developed the ability to look at any problem and find a solution, even if that solution involved things that should not work. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years becoming comfortable. Humanity reminded them what it meant to struggle, and in that struggle they found not just survival, but excellence. The Galactic Council established an annual award called the Hold My Beer Achievement in recognition of impossible accomplishments humans wanted every single year, not because other species did not try, but because other species had not spent millions of years evolving on a planet that actively tried to kill them. Velcross returned to his duties as Earth's liaison to the Council. He spent his days coordinating human missions and his nights updating his reports to Dr. Client. On evening, Sarah found him in his office. "You look tired," she said. "I am," Velcross admitted. "Your species is exhausting." Sarah laughed. "We are," she agreed. "I have been thinking," Velcross said, "about what makes humans different." And Sarah prompted. "You do not see limitations," Velcross explained. "Where we see impossible, you see a problem that no one has solved yet. That is because impossible is usually just difficult with better marketing." Sarah replied. Velcross made the sound that Centaurians use for amused agreement. "The galaxy needed you," he said. "We had become too comfortable with our limitations. We had forgotten that the universe rewards those who try." He continued. Sarah Sem,